What if some of history's greatest minds were defeated by an enemy no one could even see? In 1828, the brilliant composer Franz Schubert died at only 31, probably from typhoid fever. 20 years later, Emily Bronte, the author of Wuthering Heights, died at just 30 after suffering from tuberculosis. And in 1862, Willie Lincoln, the 11-year-old son of American President Abraham Lincoln, died from an illness believed to have been typhoid fever.
They were only a few among millions. For centuries, a tiny cut could become a deadly infection. A mother could survive childbirth, then die days later from fever. A patient could enter a hospital for an operation and never return home. People could see the suffering. They could see the fever. They could see people dying. But they could not see the enemy. Doctors had theories. Some blamed poisonous air. Others believed that living organisms could simply appear from decaying matter. Then, in 19th-century France, one scientist began looking more closely at a world invisible to the human eye. His name was Louis Pasteur. And surprisingly, he wasn't even a doctor. Yet his experiments would help transform humanity's understanding of microorganisms, disease, food safety, and vaccination. His discoveries would challenge established ideas. They would lead to fierce scientific debates. And eventually, they would help change medicine forever. But how do you prove that something too small to see can cause enormous consequences? And how did Louis Pasteur help humanity understand an enemy that had been killing people for centuries? Welcome to TalePath English. If you enjoy discovering incredible true stories while improving your English, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to TalePath English. Today, we're traveling back to 19th-century France to discover the extraordinary story of Louis Pasteur and the invisible world that changed medicine forever.
Louis Pasteur was born on December 27, 1822, in the small town of Dole in eastern France. His family was not wealthy. His father, Jean-Joseph Pasteur, had served in Napoleon's army before becoming a tanner, a craftsman who prepared animal hides to make leather. When Louis was still young, the family moved to the nearby town of Arbois. Nothing about his childhood suggested that he would one day transform science. In fact, young Louis was not known as an extraordinary scientific genius. He enjoyed fishing. He spent time with his family. And one of his greatest interests was art. As a teenager, he created detailed portraits of relatives and friends. But as he grew older, another side of his personality became stronger. Louis was patient. He was extremely careful. And once a question interested him, he could spend enormous amounts of time trying to understand it. Those qualities would eventually matter far more than anyone could have imagined. Because Pasteur was about to enter a world where the smallest details could reveal enormous truths.
Pasteur eventually traveled to Paris and studied at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. There, his attention turned to chemistry. And one of his first important discoveries came from something that seemed completely unrelated to disease: crystals. Scientists were puzzled by two substances that appeared chemically almost identical. Yet when light passed through their crystals, they behaved differently. Pasteur examined the crystals carefully under a microscope. Then he noticed something others had overlooked. Some of the tiny crystals had different shapes. They were like mirror images of each other. Pasteur painstakingly separated them by hand. When he tested them again,
their different effects on light suddenly made sense. He had shown that the three-dimensional arrangement of molecules mattered. This work helped establish his reputation as a talented young scientist. But more importantly, it revealed something about the way Pasteur worked. He believed that tiny details could explain much larger mysteries. Soon, that habit of looking closely would lead him away from crystals and towards something alive. In the 1850s, Pasteur faced a very different problem. French producers were struggling with wine and other fermented products that sometimes spoiled unexpectedly. This was not just a scientific puzzle. It was an economic problem. Spoiled wine could mean enormous losses. Pasteur began examining samples under a microscope, and there he saw something fascinating. Tiny living organisms. Different microorganisms appeared when fermentation succeeded and when products spoiled. At the time, many scientists viewed fermentation mainly as a chemical process. Pasteur argued that living microorganisms were deeply involved. Certain microbes produced useful fermentation. Others caused unwanted changes and spoilage. The invisible world was beginning to reveal itself. And Pasteur started asking a much bigger question. If microorganisms could transform wine and food, what else could they do? Pasteur's research brought him into one of the great scientific arguments of his time. Where did microorganisms come from? For centuries, many people had accepted some form of spontaneous generation, the idea that living things could arise naturally from non-living or decaying matter. Pasteur disagreed. To test the idea, he designed an elegant experiment. He placed nutrient broth inside glass flasks with long, curved necks. The shape allowed air to enter, but dust and microorganisms from the environment became trapped in the bends of the neck. The broth remained clear. When the flask was tilted so the broth touched the trapped particles, or when contamination was otherwise allowed to reach it, microbial growth appeared. The conclusion was powerful. The organisms had not simply appeared from nowhere. They had entered from the environment. The air itself was not necessarily the problem. What the air carried was. Pasteur's discoveries suggested a practical solution to another problem. If microorganisms were causing wine to spoil, perhaps they could be controlled. Pasteur discovered that gently heating wine could destroy many of the organisms responsible for spoilage without ruining the product. The idea was later applied to other liquids. The process became known as pasteurization. Today, we associate the word especially with milk. But Pasteur's early work focused largely on protecting wine and other fermented products. The principle was simple but powerful. Use controlled heat to reduce harmful or unwanted microorganisms. A scientific discovery about an invisible world had become something people could use in everyday life. But Pasteur was beginning to suspect something even more important. If microorganisms could damage food, perhaps microorganisms could also contribute to disease. Then France faced another crisis. Its silk industry was in trouble. Silkworms were becoming sick and dying in enormous numbers. Families whose livelihoods depended on silk production were desperate. In 1865, Pasteur was asked to investigate. There was one problem. He knew almost nothing about silkworms. So he did what he always did. He observed. He compared. He experimented. He examined diseased silkworms and their eggs under the microscope. Over several years, Pasteur's team helped distinguish diseases affecting the insects and developed methods for identifying infected stock and selecting healthier eggs. It was exhausting work, but the experience strengthened a revolutionary idea. Living organisms too small to see with the naked eye could be connected to disease. The invisible world was no longer just a problem for wine producers. It could affect living creatures. Pasteur was not working alone in a scientific vacuum. Across Europe, other investigators were also challenging old ideas about disease. Years earlier, Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis had shown that hand washing could dramatically reduce deaths from childbed fever in a maternity clinic. In London, John Snow had connected a deadly cholera outbreak to contaminated water. And British surgeon Joseph Lister, influenced by Pasteur's research, began using antiseptic methods to reduce infection during surgery. Later, German scientist Robert Koch would provide powerful evidence linking particular microorganisms to particular diseases. A new understanding of disease was emerging through the work of many people. Pasteur's experiments became an important part of that transformation. For doctors and scientists, the implications were enormous. If microorganisms could spread disease, then perhaps disease could sometimes be prevented. For Pasteur, disease was not only a scientific subject. It touched his own family. Louis and his wife, Marie Pasteur, had 5 children. 3 of them died young. Their daughter Jean died from typhoid fever in 1859. Camille died in 1865, and Cécile died in 1866, also from typhoid fever. Pasteur was a scientist who spent his life studying disease. But even he lived in a world where families could lose children to infections medicine could not yet control. His wife Marie became an important source of support throughout his career, helping him through years of intense work, controversy, illness, and loss. Pasteur's determination already came from his scientific personality, but now the consequences of disease were painfully personal.
By the late 1870s, Pasteur's attention had turned increasingly toward infectious disease. One of the diseases he studied was chicken cholera. During experiments, Pasteur's laboratory found that cultures of the microorganism could lose their strength over time. Chickens exposed to weakened cultures could survive. More importantly, they could later show protection against stronger exposure. The concept of vaccination itself was not new. Decades earlier, Edward Jenner had famously used cowpox to protect people against smallpox. But Pasteur and his collaborators were exploring whether weakened microorganisms could be deliberately produced and used to create immunity. Pasteur adopted the word vaccine in honor of Jenner's earlier work. The question was becoming extraordinary. Could scientists weaken an enemy and then use that weakened enemy to teach the body how to defend itself?
Pasteur's team next focused on anthrax, a deadly disease that could devastate livestock. In 1881, Pasteur participated in a dramatic public demonstration at Pouilly-le-Fort near Paris. A group of animals was vaccinated. Another group was not. Later, the animals were exposed to anthrax. Farmers, veterinarians, journalists, and officials waited to see what would happen. The result created a sensation. The vaccinated animals survived far better, while the unvaccinated animals suffered devastating losses. For the public, this was more than a laboratory experiment. It was something they could see with their own eyes. vaccination could protect living animals from a deadly infectious disease. Pasteur's reputation soared, but his most famous challenge was still ahead. And this time, the patient would be human.
Few diseases inspired more fear than rabies. It could pass from infected animals to humans, often through a bite. At first, the wound might seem manageable, but once serious neurological symptoms appeared, the disease was almost always fatal. Pasteur and his colleagues began studying rabies. They worked with infected animals and developed methods intended to weaken the infectious material. But rabies presented a difficult mystery. The microorganism responsible could not be seen with the microscopes available to Pasteur. Today, we know why. Rabies is caused by a virus far smaller than the bacteria scientists of his era were learning to observe. Pasteur could not see his enemy, but he could study what it did. And in 1885, a frightened family arrived with a desperate request. His name was Joseph Meister. He was 9 years old. In July 1885, the boy had been badly bitten by a dog believed to be rabid. His mother brought him to Pasteur. She was desperate. Without effective treatment, rabies could mean a terrible death. But Pasteur faced an enormous ethical decision. He was a chemist, not a licensed physician. And the rabies treatment had not yet been established as safe and effective in humans. After consultation with physicians, treatment began. Over a series of injections, Meister received preparations designed to provide protection before the disease could develop. Then, everyone waited. Days passed. Then, weeks. Joseph Meister survived. The case became famous around the world. Other people exposed to rabies began traveling to Pasteur seeking treatment. For families who had once faced almost certain death after rabies symptoms appeared, science suddenly offered hope. News of the rabies treatment spread quickly. People began traveling to Paris from other countries after suspected exposure to rabies. Pasteur became internationally famous. But the growing demand created another problem. His laboratory was no longer enough. France needed a permanent center where scientists could study infectious diseases, develop vaccines, and train future researchers. Support arrived from around the world. People donated money. And in 1888, the Pasteur Institute opened in Paris. Pasteur became its first director. It represented something larger than one scientist. It was a place built around a new idea. Humanity could investigate infectious diseases scientifically and use that knowledge to fight back. By now, Pasteur had become a national figure, but his life had taken a physical toll. In 1868, when he was only 45, he suffered a serious stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He recovered enough to continue working, but his health was never the same. And the famous image of a solitary genius does not tell the entire story. Pasteur relied on collaborators, assistants, physicians, veterinarians, students, and earlier discoveries made by other scientists. Some aspects of his experimental methods and public claims have also been debated by historians. Science rarely advances because one person suddenly discovers everything. It advances through experiments, mistakes, arguments, improvements, and the work of many people. Pasteur's importance was enormous, but his greatest achievements belonged to a much larger scientific revolution.
Louis Pasteur continued to be associated with the institute that carried his name as his health declined. On September 28, 1895, he died near Paris. He was 72 years old. France mourned one of its most famous scientists. But Pasteur left behind something far more important than fame. The world had changed. Microorganisms were no longer merely strange shapes seen through microscopes. Scientists increasingly understood that particular microorganisms could play crucial roles in fermentation, contamination, and disease. Hospitals were becoming cleaner. Antiseptic and later aseptic practices were transforming surgery. Vaccination science was advancing. Food could be made safer through controlled processes such as pasteurization. And laboratories around the world were investigating diseases that previous generations had been almost powerless to understand. The invisible world was finally becoming visible through science. Today, Pasteur's name is everywhere. Every time you see the word pasteurized on a bottle of milk or another product, you're seeing part of his legacy. The Pasteur Institute continues to conduct scientific research, and the principles that Pasteur helped establish contributed to a transformation in microbiology, medicine, food safety, and public health. But perhaps his most important legacy is not a single vaccine or experiment. It is a way of thinking. Do not accept an explanation simply because people have believed it for generations. Observe carefully. Test your ideas. Look for evidence. And never assume that something is unimportant simply because you cannot see it. The microorganisms surrounding us are tiny, yet understanding them transformed human history. For centuries, humanity had fought an enemy it barely understood. Pasteur helped turn that invisible world into something science could investigate. And once we began to understand it, we could begin to fight back. Before we finish, let's look at 5 useful English words from Louis Pasteur's story. Contamination. Contamination is the process of making something dirty or unsafe by introducing harmful substances or microorganisms. Pasteur's experiments showed how microorganisms from the environment could contaminate liquids. Fermentation. Fermentation is a process in which microorganisms cause chemical changes in substances, such as sugar. Pasteur studied fermentation while investigating wine and other products. Evidence. Evidence is information or facts that help prove whether an idea is true. Pasteur used carefully designed experiments to provide evidence for his scientific explanations. Immunity. Immunity is the body's ability to resist a particular infection or disease. Pasteur's vaccine research explored ways of helping the body develop immunity. Breakthrough. A breakthrough is an important discovery or development that helps solve a difficult problem. Pasteur's work contributed to major breakthroughs in microbiology and vaccination. Now it's your turn. Which part of Louis Pasteur's story do you think had the greatest impact on human life, and why? Try to use at least 2 of today's words in your answer. Contamination, fermentation, evidence, immunity, or breakthrough. For example, Pasteur's vaccine research was an important breakthrough because it provided evidence that scientists could help the body develop immunity against certain diseases. Now, write your answer in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.